The Rich Boy by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Chapter 1. Begin with an individual, and before you know it you find that you have created a type. Begin with a type, and you find that you have created nothing. That is because we are all queer fish, queerer behind our faces and voices than we want anyone to know or than we know ourselves. When I hear a man proclaiming himself an average, honest, open fellow, I feel pretty sure that he has some definite and perhaps terrible abnormality which he has agreed to conceal. And his protestation of being average and honest and open is his way of reminding himself of his misprision. There are no types, no plurals. There is a rich boy, and this is his and not his brother's story. All my life I have lived among his brothers, but this one has been my friend. Besides, if I wrote about his brothers, I should have to begin by attacking all the lies that the poor have told about the rich and the rich have told about themselves. Such a wild structure they have erected that when we pick up a book about the rich, some instinct prepares us for unreality. Even the intelligent and impassioned reporters of life have made the country of the rich as unreal as fairyland. Let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me. They possess and enjoy early, and it does something to them, makes them soft where we are hard, and cynical where we are trustful, in a way that, unless you were born rich, it is very difficult to understand. They think, deep in their hearts, that they are better than we are because we had to discover the compensations and refuges of life for ourselves. Even when they enter deep into our world or sink below us, they still think that they are better than we are. They are different. The only way I can describe young Anson Hunter is to approach him as if he were a foreigner and cling stubbornly to my point of view. If I accept his for a moment, I am lost. I have nothing to show but a preposterous movie. Chapter 2. Anson was the eldest of 6 children who would someday divide a fortune of $15 million, and he reached the age of reason. Is it 7? At the beginning of the century, when daring young women were already gliding along Fifth Avenue in electric mobiles. In those days, he and his brother had an English governess who spoke the language very clearly and crisply and well, so that the 2 boys grew to speak as she did. Their words and sentences were all crisp and clear and not run together as ours are. They didn't talk exactly like English children, but acquired an accent that is peculiar to fashionable people in the city of New York. In the summer, the 6 children were moved from the house on 71st Street to a big estate in northern Connecticut. It was not a fashionable locality. Anson's father wanted to delay as long as possible his children's knowledge of that side of life. He was a man somewhat superior to his class, which composed New York society, and to his period, which was the snobbish and formalized vulgarity of the Gilded Age. And he wanted his sons to learn habits of concentration and have sound constitutions and grow up into right living and successful men. He and his wife kept an eye on them as well as they were able until the 2 older boys went away to school, but in huge establishments this is difficult. It was much simpler in the series of small and medium-sized houses in which my own youth was spent. I was never far out of the reach of my mother's voice, of the sense of her presence, her approval or disapproval. Anson's first sense of his superiority came to him when he realized the half-grudging American deference that was paid to him in the Connecticut village. The parents of the boys he played with always inquired after his father and mother, and were vaguely excited when their own children were asked to the Hunter's house. He accepted this as the natural state of things, and a sort of impatience with all groups of which he was not the center, in money, in position, in authority, remained with him for the rest of his life. He disdained to struggle with other boys for precedence. He expected it to be given him freely, and when it wasn't he withdrew into his family. His family was sufficient, for in the East money is still a somewhat feudal thing, a clan-forming thing. In the snobbish West, money separates families to form sets. At 18, when he went to New Haven, Anson was tall and thick-set, with a clear complexion and a healthy color from the ordered life he had led in school. His hair was yellow and grew in a funny way on his head. His nose was beaked. These 2 things kept him from being handsome, but he had a confident charm and a certain brusque style, and the upper-class men who passed him on the street knew without being told that he was a rich boy and had gone to one of the best schools. Nevertheless, his very superiority kept him from being a success in college. The independence was mistaken for egotism, and the refusal to accept Yale standards with the proper awe seemed to belittle all those who had. So, long before he graduated, he began to shift the center of his life to New York. He was at home in New York. There was his own house with the kind of servants you can't get anymore, and his own family, of which, because of his good humor and a certain ability to make things go, he was rapidly becoming the center, and the debutante parties, and the correct manly world of the men's clubs, and the occasional wild spree with the gallant girls whom New Haven only knew from the fifth row. His aspirations were conventional enough. They included even the irreproachable shadow he would someday marry, but they differed from the aspirations of the majority of young men in that there was no mist over them, none of that quality which is variously known as idealism or illusion. Anson accepted without reservation the world of high finance and high extravagance, of divorce and dissipation, of snobbery and of privilege. Most of our lives end as a compromise. It was as a compromise that his life began. He and I first met in the late summer of 1917 when he was just out of Yale and, like the rest of us, was swept up into the systematized hysteria of the war. In the blue-green uniform of the naval aviation, he came down to Pensacola, where the hotel orchestras played "I'm Sorry, Dear," and we young officers danced with the girls. Everyone liked him, and though he ran with the drinkers and wasn't an especially good pilot, even the instructors treated him with a certain respect. He was always having long talks with them in his confident, logical voice, talks which ended by his getting himself, or, more frequently, another officer, out of some impending trouble. He was convivial, bawdy, robustly avid for pleasure, and we were all surprised when he fell in love with a conservative and rather proper girl. Her name was Paula Legendre, a dark, serious beauty from somewhere in California. Her family kept a winter residence just outside of town, and in spite of her primness, she was enormously popular. There is a large class of men whose egotism can't endure humor in a woman. But Anson wasn't that sort, and I couldn't understand the attraction of her sincerity. That was the thing to say about her, for his keen and somewhat sardonic mind. Nevertheless, they fell in love, and on her terms. He no longer joined the twilight gathering at the DeSoto bar, and whenever they were seen together they were engaged in a long, serious dialogue, which must have gone on several weeks. Long afterward he told me that it was not about anything in particular, but was composed on both sides of immature and even meaningless statements. The emotional content that gradually came to fill it grew up not out of the words, but out of its enormous seriousness. It was a sort of hypnosis. Often it was interrupted, giving way to that emasculated humor we call fun. When they were alone it was resumed again, solemn, low-keyed, and pitched so as to give each other a sense of unity in feeling and thought. They came to resent any interruptions of it, to be unresponsive to facetiousness about life, even to the mild cynicism of their contemporaries. They were only happy when the dialogue was going on, and its seriousness bathed them like the amber glow of an open fire. Toward the end there came an interruption they did not resent. It began to be interrupted by passion. Oddly enough, Anson was as engrossed in the dialogue as she was and as profoundly affected by it, yet at the same time aware that on his side much was insincere, and on hers much was merely simple. At first, too, he despised her emotional simplicity as well, but with his love her nature deepened and blossomed, and he could despise it no longer. He felt that if he could enter into Paula's warm, safe life, he would be happy. The long preparation of the dialogue removed any constraint. He taught her some of what he had learned from more adventurous women, and she responded with a rapt, holy intensity. One evening after a dance they agreed to marry, and he wrote a long letter about her to his mother. The next day Paula told him that she was rich, that she had a personal fortune of nearly $1 million. Chapter 3. It was exactly as if they could say, "Neither of us has anything. We shall be poor together, just as delightful that they should be rich instead." It gave them the same communion of adventure. Yet when Anson got leave in April, and Paula and her mother accompanied him north, she was impressed with the standing of his family in New York and with the scale on which they lived. Alone with Anson for the first time in the rooms where he had played as a boy, she was filled with a comfortable emotion, as though she were preeminently safe and taken care of. The pictures of Anson in a skull cap at his first school, of Anson on horseback with the sweetheart of a mysterious forgotten summer, of Anson in a gay group of ushers and bridesmaid at a wedding, made her jealous of his life apart from her in the past, and so completely did his authoritative person seem to sum up and typify these possessions of his that she was inspired with the idea of being married immediately and returning to Pensacola as his wife. But an immediate marriage wasn't discussed. Even the engagement was to be secret until after the war. When she realized that only 2 days of his leave remained, her dissatisfaction crystallized in the intention of making him as unwilling to wait as she was. They were driving to the country for dinner, and she determined to force the issue that night. Now a cousin of Paula's was staying with them at the Ritz, a severe, bitter girl who loved Paula, but was somewhat jealous of her impressive engagement, and as Paula was late in dressing, the cousin, who wasn't going to the party, received Anson in the parlor of the suite. Anson had met friends at 5 o'clock and drunk freely and indiscreetly with them for an hour. He left the Yale Club at a proper time, and his mother's chauffeur drove him to the Ritz, but his usual capacity was not in evidence, and the impact of the steam-heated sitting room made him suddenly dizzy. He knew it, and he was both amused and sorry. Paula's cousin was 25, but she was exceptionally naive, and at first failed to realize what was up. She had never met Anson before, and she was surprised when he mumbled strange information and nearly fell off his chair. But until Paula appeared, it didn't occur to her that what she had taken for the odor of a dry-cleaned uniform was really whiskey. But Paula understood as soon as she appeared. Her only thought was to get Anson away before her mother saw him, and at the look in her eyes the cousin understood too. When Paula and Anson descended to the limousine, they found 2 men inside, both asleep. They were the men with whom he had been drinking at the Yale Club, and they were also going to the party. He had entirely forgotten their presence in the car. On the way to Hempstead, they awoke and sang. Some of the songs were rough, and though Paula tried to reconcile herself to the fact that Anson had few verbal inhibitions, her lips tightened with shame and distaste. Back at the hotel, the cousin, confused and agitated, considered the incident, and then walked into Mrs. Legender's bedroom, saying, "Isn't he funny?" "Who is funny?" "Why, Mr. Hunter. He seemed so funny." Mrs. Legendre looked at her sharply. "How is he funny?" "Why, he said he was French." "I didn't know he was French." "That's absurd. You must have misunderstood." She smiled. "It was a joke?" The cousin shook her head stubbornly. "No. He said he was brought up in France. He said he couldn't speak any English, and that's why he couldn't talk to me. And he couldn't." Mrs. Legendre looked away with impatience, just as the cousin added thoughtfully, "Perhaps it was because he was so drunk," and walked out of the room. This curious report was true. Anson, finding his voice thick and uncontrollable, had taken the unusual refuge of announcing that he spoke no English. Years afterward, he used to tell that part of the story, and he invariably communicated the uproarious laughter which the memory aroused in him. 5 times in the next hour, Mrs. Legendre tried to get Hempstead on the phone. When she succeeded, there was a 10-minute delay before she heard Paula's voice on the wire. "Cousin Joe told me Anson was intoxicated." "Oh, no." "Oh, yes. Cousin Joe says he was intoxicated. He told her he was French, and fell off his chair and behaved as if he was very intoxicated. I don't want you to come home with him." "Mother, he's all right. Please don't worry about." "But I do worry. I think it's dreadful. I want you to promise me not to come home with him." "I'll take care of it, Mother." "I don't want you to come home with him." "All right, Mother. Goodbye." "Be sure now, Paula. Ask someone to bring you." Deliberately, Paula took the receiver from her ear and hung it up. Her face was flushed with helpless annoyance. Anson was stretched to sleep out in a bedroom upstairs, while the dinner party below was proceeding lamely toward conclusion. The hour's drive had sobered him somewhat. His arrival was merely hilarious, and Paula hoped that the evening was not spoiled. After all, but 2 imprudent cocktails before dinner completed the disaster. He talked boisterously and somewhat offensively to the party at large for 15 minutes, and then slid silently under the table, like a man in an old print. But, unlike an old print, it was rather horrible without being at all quaint. None of the young girls present remarked upon the incident. It seemed to merit only silence. His uncle and 2 other men carried him upstairs, and it was just after this that Paula was called to the phone. An hour later, Anson awoke in a fog of nervous agony, through which he perceived after a moment the figure of his Uncle Robert standing by the door. "I said, are you better?" "What?" "Do you feel better, old man?" "Terrible," said Anson. "I'm going to try you on another bromo-seltzer. If you can hold it down, it'll do you good to sleep." With an effort, Anson slid his legs from the bed and stood up. "I'm all right," he said dully. "Take it easy. If you gave me a glass brandy, I could go downstairs." "Oh, no." "Yes, that's the only thin. I'm all right now. I suppose I'm in Dutch dow there." "They know you're a little under the weather," said his uncle deprecatingly. "But don't worry about it. Schuyler didn't even get here. He passed away in the locker room over at the Lynx." Indifferent to any opinion, except Paula's, Anson was nevertheless determined to save the debris of the evening, but when after a cold bath he made his appearance, most of the party had already left. Paula got up immediately to go home. In the limousine, the old serious dialogue began. She had known that he drank, she admitted, but she had never expected anything like this. It seemed to her that perhaps they were not suited to each other, after all. Their ideas about life were too different, and so forth. When she finished speaking, Anson spoke in turn, very soberly. Then Paula said she'd have to think it over. She wouldn't decide tonight. She was not angry, but she was terribly sorry. Nor would she let him come into the hotel with her. But just before she got out of the car, she leaned and kissed him unhappily on the cheek. The next afternoon, Anson had a long talk with Mrs. Legendre, while Paula sat listening in silence. It was agreed that Paula was to brood over the incident for a proper period, and then, if mother and daughter thought it best, they would follow Anson to Pensacola. On his part, he apologized with sincerity and dignity. That was all. With every card in her hand, Mrs. Legendre was unable to establish any advantage over him. He made no promises, showed no humility, only delivered a few serious comments on life, which brought him off with rather a moral superiority at the end. When they came south 3 weeks later, neither Anson in his satisfaction nor Paula in her relief at the reunion realized that the psychological moment had passed forever. Chapter 4. He dominated and attracted her, and at the same time filled her with anxiety. Confused by his mixture of solidity and self-indulgence, of sentiment and cynicism, incongruities which her gentle mind was unable to resolve, Paula grew to think of him as 2 alternating personalities. When she saw him alone, or at a formal party, or with his casual inferiors, she felt a tremendous pride in his strong, attractive presence, the paternal, understanding stature of his mind. In other company, she became uneasy when what had been a fine imperviousness to mere gentility showed its other face. The other face was gross, humorous, reckless of everything but pleasure. It startled her mind temporarily away from him, even led her into a short, covert experiment with an old beau, but it was no use. After 4 months of Anson's enveloping vitality, there was an anemic pallor in all other men. In July, he was ordered abroad, and their tenderness and desire reached a crescendo. Paula considered a last-minute marriage, decided against it only because there were always cocktails on his breath now, but the parting itself made her physically ill with grief. After his departure, she wrote him long letters of regret for the days of love they had missed by waiting. In August, Anson's plane slipped down into the North Sea. He was pulled onto a destroyer after a night in the water and sent to hospital with pneumonia. The armistice was signed before he was finally sent home. Then, with every opportunity given back to them, with no material obstacle to overcome, the secret weavings of their temperaments came between them, drying up their kisses and their tears, making their voices less loud to one another, muffling the intimate chatter of their hearts until the old communication was only possible by letters from far away. One afternoon, a society reporter waited for 2 hours in the Hunter's house for a confirmation of their engagement. Anson denied it. Nevertheless, an early issue carried the report as a leading paragraph. They were constantly seen together at Southampton, Hot Springs, and Tuxedo Park. But the serious dialogue had turned a corner into a long-sustained quarrel, and the affair was almost played out. Anson got drunk flagrantly and missed an engagement with her, whereupon Paula made certain behavioristic demands. His despair was helpless before his pride and his knowledge of himself. The engagement was definitely broken. "Dearest," said their letters now, "dearest, dearest, when I wake up in the middle of the night and realize that after all it was not to be, I feel that I want to die. I can't go on living anymore. Perhaps when we meet this summer we may talk things over and decide differently. We were so excited and sad that day, and I don't feel that I can live all my life without you. You speak of other people. Don't you know there are no other people for me, but only you?" But as Paula drifted here and there around the East, she would sometimes mention her gaieties to make him wonder. Anson was too acute to wonder. When he saw a man's name in her letters, he felt more sure of her and a little disdainful. He was always superior to such things. But he still hoped that they would someday marry. Meanwhile, he plunged vigorously into all the movement and glitter of postbellum New York, entering a brokerage house, joining half a dozen clubs, dancing late, and moving in 3 worlds. His own world, the world of young Yale graduates, and that section of the half-world which rests one end on Broadway. But there was always a thorough and infractable 8 hours devoted to his work in Wall Street, where the combination of his influential family connection, his sharp intelligence, and his abundance of sheer physical energy brought him almost immediately forward. He had one of those invaluable minds with partitions in it. Sometimes he appeared at his office refreshed by less than an hour's sleep, but such occurrences were rare. So early as 1920, his income in salary and commissions exceeded $12,000. As the Yale tradition slipped into the past, he became more and more of a popular figure among his classmates in New York, more popular than he had ever been in college. He lived in a great house, and had the means of introducing young men into other great houses. Moreover, his life already seemed secure, while theirs, for the most part, had arrived again at precarious beginnings. They commenced to turn to him for amusement and escape, and Anson responded readily, taking pleasure in helping people and arranging their affairs. There were no men in Paula's letters now, but a note of tenderness ran through them that had not been there before. From several sources he heard that she had a heavy beau, Lowell Thayer, a Bostonian of wealth and position, and though he was sure she still loved him, it made him uneasy to think that he might lose her, after all. Save for one unsatisfactory day, she had not been in New York for almost 5 months, and as the rumors multiplied, he became increasingly anxious to see her. In February, he took his vacation and went down to Florida. Palm Beach sprawled plump and opulent between the sparkling sapphire of Lake Worth, flawed here and there by houseboats at anchor, and the great turquoise bar of the Atlantic Ocean. The huge bulks of the breakers and the Royal Poinciana rose as twin paunches from the bright level of the sand, and around them clustered the Dancing Glade, Bradley's House of Chance, and a dozen modistes and milliners with goods at triple prices from New York. Upon the trellised veranda of the breakers 200 women stepped right, stepped left, wheeled, and slid in that then celebrated calisthenic known as the double shuffle, while in half-time to the music 2,000 bracelets clicked up and down on 200 arms. At the Everglades Club after dark, Paula and Lowell Thayer and Anson and a casual fourth played bridge with hot cards. It seemed to Anson that her kind, serious face was wan and tired. She had been around now for 4, 5 years. He had known her for 3. 2 spades. Cigarette? Oh, I beg your pardon. Buy me. Buy. I'll double 3 spades. There were a dozen tables of bridge in the room, which was filling up with smoke. Anson's eyes met Paula's, held them persistently even when Thayer's glance fell between them. "What was bid?" he asked abstractedly. Rose of Washington Square, sang the young people in the corners. I'm withering there, in basement air. The smoke banked like fog, and the opening of a door filled the room with blown swirls of ectoplasm. Little bright eyes streaked past the tables seeking Mr. Conan Doyle among the Englishmen who were posing as Englishmen about the lobby. You could cut it with a knife. Cut it with a knife. A knife. At the end of the rubber, Paula suddenly got up and spoke to Anson in a tense, low voice. With scarcely a glance at Lowell Thayer, they walked out the door and descended a long flight of stone steps. In a moment they were walking hand in hand along the moonlit beach. Darling, darling. They embraced recklessly, passionately, in a shadow. Then Paula drew back her face to let his lips say what she wanted to hear. She could feel the words forming as they kissed again. Again she broke away, listening. But as he pulled her close once more, she realized that he had said nothing. Only, darling, darling, in that deep, sad whisper that always made her cry. Humbly, obediently, her emotions yielded to him and the tears streamed down her face, but her heart kept on crying, "Ask me, oh, Anson, dearest, ask me." Paula, Paula. The words wrung her heart like hands, and Anson, feeling her tremble, knew that emotion was enough. He need say no more, commit their destinies to no practical enigma. Why should he, when he might hold her so, biding his own time, for another year, forever? He was considering them both, her more than himself. For a moment, when she said suddenly that she must go back to her hotel, he hesitated, thinking, first, this is the moment, after all, and then, no, let it wait. She is mine. He had forgotten that Paula too was worn away inside with the strain of 3 years. Her mood passed forever in the night. He went back to New York next morning filled with a certain restless dissatisfaction. Late in April, without warning, he received a telegram from Bar Harbor in which Paula told him that she was engaged to Lowell Thayer, and that they would be married immediately in Boston. What he never really believed could happen had happened at last. Anson filled himself with whiskey that morning, and going to the office, carried on his work without a break, rather with a fear of what would happen if he stopped. In the evening he went out as usual, saying nothing of what had occurred. He was cordial, humorous, unabstracted. But one thing he could not help. For 3 days, in any place, in any company, he would suddenly bend his head into his hands and cry like a child. Chapter 5. In 1922, when Anson went abroad with the junior partner to investigate some London loans, the journey intimated that he was to be taken into the firm. He was 27 now, a little heavy without being definitely stout, and with a manner older than his years. Old people and young people liked him and trusted him, and mothers felt safe when their daughters were in his charge, for he had a way, when he came into a room, of putting himself on a footing with the oldest and most conservative people there. You and I, he seemed to say, we're solid. We understand. He had an instinctive and rather charitable knowledge of the weaknesses of men and women, and like a priest, it made him the more concerned for the maintenance of outward forms. It was typical of him that every Sunday morning he taught in a fashionable Episcopal Sunday school, even though a cold shower and a quick change into a cutaway coat were all that separated him from the wild night before. After his father's death, he was the practical head of his family, and in effect, guided the destinies of the younger children. Through a complication, his authority did not extend to his father's estate, which was administrated by his Uncle Robert, who was the horsey member of the family, a good-natured, hard-drinking member of that set which centers about Wheatley Hills. Uncle Robert and his wife, Edna, had been great friends of Anson's youth, and the former was disappointed when his nephew's superiority failed to take a horsey form. He backed him for a city club which was the most difficult in America to enter. One could only join if one's family had helped to build up New York, or, in other words, were rich before 1880. And when Anson, after his election, neglected it for the Yale Club, Uncle Robert gave him a little talk on the subject. But when on top of that Anson declined to enter Robert Hunter's own conservative and somewhat neglected brokerage house, his manner grew cooler. Like a primary teacher who has taught all he knew, he slipped out of Anson's life. There were so many friends in Anson's life, scarcely one for whom he had not done some unusual kindness, and scarcely one whom he did not occasionally embarrass by his bursts of rough conversation or his habit of getting drunk whenever and however he liked. It annoyed him when anyone else blundered in that regard. About his own lapses he was always humorous. Odd things happened to him, and he told them with infectious laughter. I was working in New York that spring, and I used to lunch with him at the Yale Club, which my university was sharing until the completion of our own. I had read of Paula's marriage, and one afternoon, when I asked him about her, something moved him to tell me the story. After that, he frequently invited me to family dinners at his house and behaved as though there was a special relation between us, as though with his confidence a little of that consuming memory had passed into me. I found that despite the trusting mothers, his attitude toward girls was not indiscriminately protective. It was up to the girl. If she showed an inclination toward looseness, she must take care of herself, even with him. Life, he would explain sometimes, has made a cynic of me. By life he meant Paula. Sometimes, especially when he was drinking, it became a little twisted in his mind, and he thought that she had callously thrown him over. This cynicism, or rather his realization that naturally fast girls were not worth sparing, led to his affair with Dolly Carter. It wasn't his only affair in those years, but it came nearest to touching him deeply, and it had a profound effect upon his attitude toward life. Dolly was the daughter of a notorious publicist who had married into society. She herself grew up into the junior league, came out at the plaza, and went to the assembly. And only a few old families like the Hunters could question whether or not she belonged, for her picture was often in the papers, and she had more enviable attention than many girls who undoubtedly did. She was dark-haired, with carmine lips and a high, lovely color, which she concealed under pinkish-gray powder all through the first year out, because high color was unfashionable. Victorian pale was the thing to be. She wore black, severe suits and stood with her hands in her pockets leaning a little forward, with a humorous restraint on her face. She danced exquisitely, better than anything she liked to dance, better than anything except making love. Since she was 10, she had always been in love, and usually with some boy who didn't respond to her. Those who did, and there were many, bored her after a brief encounter, but for her failures she reserved the warmest spot in her heart. When she met them, she would always try once more. Sometimes she succeeded, more often she failed. It never occurred to this gypsy of the unattainable that there was a certain resemblance in those who refused to love her. They shared a hard intuition that saw through to her weakness, not a weakness of emotion, but a weakness of rudder. Anson perceived this when he first met her, less than a month after Paula's marriage. He was drinking rather heavily, and he pretended for a week that he was falling in love with her. Then he dropped her abruptly and forgot. Immediately he took up the commanding position in her heart. Like so many girls of that day, Dolly was slackly and indiscreetly wild. The unconventionality of a slightly older generation had been simply one facet of a post-war movement to discredit obsolete manners. Dolly's was both older and shabbier, and she saw in Anson the two extremes which the emotionally shiftless woman seeks, an abandon to indulgence alternating with a protective strength. In his character she felt both the sybarite and the solid rock, and these two satisfied every need of her nature. She felt that it was going to be difficult, but she mistook the reason. She thought that Anson and his family expected a more spectacular marriage, but she guessed immediately that her advantage lay in his tendency to drink. They met at the large debutante dances, but as her infatuation increased, they managed to be more and more together. Like most mothers, Mrs. Carter believed that Anson was exceptionally reliable, so she allowed Dolly to go with him to distant country clubs and suburban houses without inquiring closely into their activities or questioning her explanations when they came in late. At first, these explanations might have been accurate, but Dolly's worldly ideas of capturing Anson were soon engulfed in the rising sweep of her emotion. Kisses in the back of taxis and motor cars were no longer enough. They did a curious thing. They dropped out of their world for a while and made another world just beneath it where Anson's tippling and Dolly's irregular hours would be less noticed and commented on. It was composed, this world, of varying elements. Several of Anson's Yale friends and their wives, 2 or 3 young brokers and bond salesmen, and a handful of unattached men, fresh from college, with money and a propensity to dissipation. What this world lacked in spaciousness and scale it made up for by allowing them a liberty that it scarcely permitted itself. Moreover, it centered around them and permitted Dolly the pleasure of a faint condescension. A pleasure which Anson, whose whole life was a condescension from the certitudes of his childhood, was unable to share. He was not in love with her, and in the long feverish winter of their affair he frequently told her so. In the spring he was weary. He wanted to renew his life at some other source. Moreover, he saw that either he must break with her now or accept the responsibility of a definite seduction. Her family's encouraging attitude precipitated his decision. One evening when Mr. Carger knocked discreetly at the library door to announce that he had left a bottle of old brandy in the dining room, Anson felt that life was hemming him in. That night he wrote her a short letter in which he told her that he was going on his vacation, and that in view of all the circumstances they had better meet no more. It was June. His family had closed up the house and gone to the country, so he was living temporarily at the Yale Club. I had heard about his affair with Dolly as it developed, accounts salted with humor, for he despised unstable women and granted them no place in the social edifice in which he believed. And when he told me that night that he was definitely breaking with her, I was glad. I had seen Dolly here and there, and each time with a feeling of pity at the hopelessness of her struggle, and of shame at knowing so much about her that I had no right to know. She was what is known as a pretty little thing, but there was a certain recklessness which rather fascinated me. Her dedication to the goddess of waste would have been less obvious had she been less spirited. She would most certainly throw herself away, but I was glad when I heard that the sacrifice would not be consummated in my sight. Anson was going to leave the letter of farewell at her house next morning. It was one of the few houses left open in the Fifth Avenue district, and he knew that the Cargers, acting upon erroneous information from Dolly, had foregone a trip abroad to give their daughter her chance. As he stepped out the door of the Yale Club into Madison Avenue, the postman passed him, and he followed back inside. The first letter that caught his eye was in Dolly's hand. He knew what it would be, a lonely and tragic monologue, full of the reproaches he knew, the invoked memories, the I wonder ifs, all the immemorial intimacies that he had communicated to Paula Legendre in what seemed another age. Thumbing over some bills, he brought it on top again and opened it. To his surprise, it was a short, somewhat formal note, which said that Dolly would be unable to go to the country with him for the weekend, because Perry Hull from Chicago had unexpectedly come to town. It added that Anson had brought this on himself. If I felt that you loved me as I love you, I would go with you at any time, any place, but Perry is so nice, and he so much wants me to marry him. Anson smiled contemptuously. He had had experience with such decoy epistles. Moreover, he knew how Dolly had labored over this plan, probably sent for the faithful Perry and calculated the time of his arrival, even labored over the note so that it would make him jealous without driving him away. Like most compromises, it had neither force nor vitality, but only a timorous despair. Suddenly he was angry. He sat down in the lobby and read it again. Then he went to the phone, called Dolly, and told her in his clear, compelling voice that he had received her note and would call for her at 5 o'clock as they had previously planned. Scarcely waiting for the pretended uncertainty of her, "Perhaps I can see you for an hour," he hung up the receiver and went down to his office. On the way, he tore his own letter into bits and dropped it in the street. He was not jealous. She meant nothing to him. But at her pathetic ruse, everything stubborn and self-indulgent in him came to the surface. It was a presumption from a mental inferior, and it could not be overlooked. If she wanted to know to whom she belonged, she would see. He was on the doorstep at 5:15. Dolly was dressed for the street, and he listened in silence to the paragraph of "I can only see you for an hour," which she had begun on the phone. "Put on your hat, Dolly," he said. "We'll take a walk." They strolled up Madison Avenue, and over to Fifth while Anson's shirt dampened upon his portly body in the deep heat. He talked little, scolding her, making no love to her, but before they had walked 6 blocks she was his again, apologizing for the note, offering not to see Perry at all as an atonement, offering anything. She thought that he had come because he was beginning to love her. "I'm hot," he said when they reached 71st Street. "This is a winter suit. If I stop by the house and change, would you mind waiting for me downstairs? I'll only be a minute." She was happy. The intimacy of his being hot, of any physical fact about him, thrilled her. When they came to the iron-grated door and Anson took out his key, she experienced a sort of delight. Downstairs it was dark, and after he ascended in the lift, Dolly raised a curtain and looked out through opaque lace at the houses over the way. She heard the lift machinery stop, and with the notion of teasing him pressed the button that brought it down. Then on what was more than an impulse she got into it, and sent it up to what she guessed was his floor. "Anson," she called, laughing a little. "Just a minute," he answered from his bedroom, then after a brief delay, "Now you can come in." He had changed and was buttoning his vest. "This is my room," he said lightly. "How do you like it?" She caught sight of Paula's picture on the wall and stared at it in fascination, just as Paula had stared at the pictures of Anson's childish sweethearts 5 years before. She knew something about Paula. Sometimes she tortured herself with fragments of the story. Suddenly she came close to Anson, raising her arms. They embraced. Outside the area window, a soft artificial twilight already hovered, though the sun was still bright on a back roof across the way. In half an hour the room would be quite dark. The uncalculated opportunity overwhelmed them, made them both breathless, and they clung more closely. It was imminent, inevitable. Still holding one another, they raised their heads. Their eyes fell together upon Paula's picture, staring down at them from the wall. Suddenly Anson dropped his arms, and sitting down at his desk tried the drawer with a bunch of keys. "Like a drink?" he asked in a gruff voice. "No, Anson." He poured himself half a tumbler of whiskey, swallowed it, and then opened the door into the hall. "Come on," he said. Dolly hesitated. "Anson, I'm going to the country with you tonight, after all. You understand that, don't you?" "Of course," he answered brusquely. In Dolly's car they rode on to Long Island, closer in their emotions than they had ever been before. They knew what would happen, not with Paula's face to remind them that something was lacking, but when they were alone in the still, hot Long Island night they did not care. The estate in Port Washington where they were to spend the weekend belonged to a cousin of Anson's who had married a Montana copper operator. An interminable drive began at the lodge and twisted under imported poplar saplings toward a huge, pink, Spanish house. Anson had often visited there before. After dinner they danced at the Lynx Club. About midnight Anson assured himself that his cousins would not leave before 2. Then he explained that Dolly was tired. He would take her home and return to the dance later. Trembling a little with excitement, they got into a borrowed car together and drove to Port Washington. As they reached the lodge he stopped and spoke to the night watchman. "When are you making a round, Carl?" "Right away." "Then you'll be here till everybody's in?" "Yes, sir." "All right. Listen, if any automobile, no matter whose it is, turns in at this gate, I want you to phone the house immediately." He put a $5 bill into Carl's hand. "Is that clear?" "Yes, Mr. Anson." Being of the old world, he neither winked nor smiled. Yet Dolly sat with her face turned slightly away. Anson had a key. Once inside, he poured a drink for both of them. Dolly left hers untouched. Then he ascertained definitely the location of the phone, and found that it was within easy hearing distance of their rooms, both of which were on the first floor. 5 minutes later, he knocked at the door of Dolly's room. "Anson?" He went in, closing the door behind him. She was in bed, leaning up anxiously with elbows on the pillow. Sitting beside her, he took her in his arms. "Anson, darling." He didn't answer. "Anson, Anson, I love you. Say you love me. Say it now. Can't you say it now? Even if you don't mean it?" He did not listen. Over her head, he perceived that the picture of Paula was hanging here upon this wall. He got up and went close to it. The frame gleamed faintly with thrice-reflected moonlight. Within was a blurred shadow of a face that he saw he did not know. Almost sobbing, he turned around and stared with abomination at the little figure on the bed. "This is all foolishness," he said thickly. "I don't know what I was thinking about. I don't love you, and you'd better wait for somebody that loves you. I don't love you a bit. Can't you understand?" His voice broke, and he went hurriedly out. Back in the salon, he was pouring himself a drink with uneasy fingers when the front door opened suddenly and his cousin came in. "Why, Anson, I hear Dolly's sick," she began solicitously. "I hear she's sick." "It was nothing," he interrupted, raising his voice so that it would carry into Dolly's room. "She was a little tired. She went to bed." For a long time afterward, Anson believed that a protective God sometimes interfered in human affairs. But Dolly Carger, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, never again believed in anything at all. Chapter 6. When Dolly married during the following autumn, Anson was in London on business. Like Paula's marriage, it was sudden, but it affected him in a different way. At first he felt that it was funny, and had an inclination to laugh when he thought of it. Later it depressed him. It made him feel old. There was something repetitive about it. Why? Paula and Dolly had belonged to different generations. He had a foretaste of the sensation of a man of 40 who hears that the daughter of an old flame has married. He wired congratulations and, as was not the case with Paula, they were sincere. He had never really hoped that Paula would be happy. When he returned to New York, he was made a partner in the firm, and, as his responsibilities increased, he had less time on his hands. The refusal of a life insurance company to issue him a policy made such an impression on him that he stopped drinking for a year, and claimed that he felt better physically, though I think he missed the convivial recounting of those Cellini-esque adventures which, in his early 20s, had played such a part of his life. But he never abandoned the Yale Club. He was a figure there, a personality, and the tendency of his class, who were now 7 years out of college, to drift away to more sober haunts was checked by his presence. His day was never too full nor his mind too weary to give any sort of aid to anyone who asked it. What had been done at first through pride and superiority had become a habit and a passion. And there was always something. A younger brother in trouble at New Haven, a quarrel to be patched up between a friend and his wife, a position to be found for this man, an investment for that. But his specialty was the solving of problems for young married people. Young married people fascinated him, and their apartments were almost sacred to him. He knew the story of their love affair, advised them where to live and how, and remembered their babies' names. Toward young wives his attitude was circumspect. He never abused the trust which their husbands, strangely enough in view of his unconcealed irregularities, invariably reposed in him. He came to take a vicarious pleasure in happy marriages, and to be inspired to an almost equally pleasant melancholy by those that went astray. Not a season passed that he did not witness the collapse of an affair that perhaps he himself had fathered. When Paula was divorced and almost immediately remarried to another Bostonian, he talked about her to me all one afternoon. He would never love anyone as he had loved Paula, but he insisted that he no longer cared. "I'll never marry," he came to say. "I've seen too much of it, and I know a happy marriage is a very rare thing. Besides, I'm too old." But he did believe in marriage. Like all men who spring from a happy and successful marriage, he believed in it passionately. Nothing he had seen would change his belief. His cynicism dissolved upon it like air. But he did really believe he was too old. At 28 he began to accept with equanimity the prospect of marrying without romantic love. He resolutely chose a New York girl of his own class, pretty, intelligent, congenial, above reproach, and set about falling in love with her. The things he had said to Paula with sincerity, to other girls with grace, he could no longer say at all without smiling, or with the force necessary to convince. "When I'm 40, he told his friends, I'll be ripe. I'll fall for some chorus girl like the rest." Nevertheless, he persisted in his attempt. His mother wanted to see him married, and he could now well afford it. He had a seat on the stock exchange, and his earned income came to $25,000 a year. The idea was agreeable. When his friends, he spent most of his time with the set he and Dolly had evolved, closed themselves in behind domestic doors at night, he no longer rejoiced in his freedom. He even wondered if he should have married Dolly. Not even Paula had loved him more, and he was learning the rarity, in a single life, of encountering true emotion. Just as this mood began to creep over him, a disquieting story reached his ear. His Aunt Edna, a woman just this side of 40, was carrying on an open intrigue with a dissolute, hard-drinking young man named Carrie Sloane. Everyone knew of it except Anson's Uncle Robert, who for 15 years had talked long in clubs and taken his wife for granted. Anson heard the story again and again with increasing annoyance. Something of his old feeling for his uncle came back to him, a feeling that was more than personal, a reversion toward that family solidarity on which he had based his pride. His intuition singled out the essential point of the affair, which was that his uncle shouldn't be hurt. It was his first experiment in unsolicited meddling, but with his knowledge of Edna's character, he felt that he could handle the matter better than a district judge or his uncle. His uncle was in hot springs. Anson traced down the sources of the scandal so that there should be no possibility of mistake, and then he called Edna and asked her to lunch with him at the plaza next day. Something in his tone must have frightened her, for she was reluctant, but he insisted, putting off the date until she had no excuse for refusing. She met him at the appointed time in the plaza lobby, a lovely, faded, gray-eyed blonde in a coat of Russian sable. 5 great rings, cold with diamonds and emeralds, sparkled on her slender hands. It occurred to Anson that it was his father's intelligence, and not his uncle's, that had earned the fur and the stones, the rich brilliance that buoyed up her passing beauty. Though Edna scented his hostility, she was unprepared for the directness of his approach. "Edna, I'm astonished at the way you've been acting," he said in a strong, frank voice. "At first I couldn't believe it." "Believe what?" she demanded sharply. "You needn't pretend with me, Edna. I'm talking about Carrie Sloane. Aside from any other consideration, I didn't think you could treat Uncle Robert." "Now look here, Anson," she began angrily, but his peremptory voice broke through hers. "And your children in such a way. You've been married 18 years, and you're old enough to know better. You can't talk to me like that. You—" "Yes, I can. Uncle Robert has always been my best friend." He was tremendously moved. He felt a real distress about his uncle, about his 3 young cousins. Edna stood up, leaving her crabflake cocktail untasted. "This is the silliest thing." "Very well. If you won't listen to me, I'll go to Uncle Robert and tell him the whole story. He's bound to hear it sooner or later. And afterward, I'll go to old Moses Sloane." Edna faltered back into her chair. "Don't talk so loud," she begged him. Her eyes blurred with tears. "You have no idea how your voice carries. You might have chosen a less public place to make all these crazy accusations." He didn't answer. "Oh, you never liked me, I know," she went on. "You're just taking advantage of some silly gossip to try and break up the only interesting friendship I've ever had. What did I ever do to make you hate me so?" Still Anson waited. There would be the appeal to his chivalry, then to his pity, finally to his superior sophistication. When he had shouldered his way through all these, there would be admissions, and he could come to grips with her. By being silent, by being impervious, by returning constantly to his main weapon, which was his own true emotion, he bullied her into frantic despair as the luncheon hour slipped away. At 2 o'clock she took out a mirror and a handkerchief, shined away the marks of her tears, and powdered the slight hollows where they had lain. She had agreed to meet him at her own house at 5. When he arrived, she was stretched on a chaise longue which was covered with cretonne for the summer, and the tears he had called up at luncheon seemed still to be standing in her eyes. Then he was aware of Carrie Sloane's dark, anxious presence upon the cold hearth. "What's this idea of yours?" broke out Sloane immediately. "I understand you invited Edna to lunch and then threatened her on the basis of some cheap scandal." Anson sat down. I have no reason to think it's only scandal. I hear you're going to take it to Robert Hunter and to my father." Anson nodded. "Either you break it off, or I will," he said. "What goddamned business is it of yours, Hunter?" "Don't lose your temper, Carrie," said Edna nervously. "It's only a question of showing him how absurd." "For one thing, it's my name that's being handed around," interrupted Anson. "That's all that concerns you, Carrie. Edna isn't a member of your family." "She most certainly is." His anger mounted. "Why? She owes this house and the rings on her fingers to my father's brains. When Uncle Robert married her, she didn't have a penny." They all looked at the rings as if they had a significant bearing on the situation. Edna made a gesture to take them from her hand. "I guess they're not the only rings in the world," said Sloane. "Oh, this is absurd," cried Edna. "Anson, will you listen to me? I found out how the silly story started. It was a maid I discharged who went right to the Chilichevs. All these Russians pump things out of their servants and then put a false meaning on them." She brought down her fist angrily on the table. "And after Tom lent them the limousine for a whole month when we were south last winter—" "Do you see?" demanded Sloane eagerly. "This maid got hold of the wrong end of the thing. She knew that Edna and I were friends, and she carried it to the Chilichevs. In Russia they assume that if a man and a woman—" He enlarged the theme to a disquisition upon social relations in the Caucasus. "If that's the case, it better be explained to Uncle Robert," said Anson dryly, "so that when the rumors do reach him, he'll know they're not true." Adopting the method he had followed with Edna at luncheon, he let them explain it all away. He knew that they were guilty and that presently they would cross the line from explanation into justification and convict themselves more definitely than he could ever do. By 7, they had taken the desperate step of telling him the truth. Robert Hunter's neglect, Edna's empty life, the casual dalliance that had flamed up into passion. But like so many true stories, it had the misfortune of being old, and its enfeebled body beat helplessly against the armor of Anson's will. The threat to go to Sloane's father sealed their helplessness, for the latter, a retired cotton broker out of Alabama, was a notorious fundamentalist who controlled his son by a rigid allowance and the promise that at his next vagary the allowance would stop forever. They dined at a small French restaurant, and the discussion continued. At one time, Sloane resorted to physical threats. A little later, they were both imploring him to give them time. But Anson was obdurate. He saw that Edna was breaking up, and that her spirit must not be refreshed by any renewal of their passion. At 2 o'clock in a small nightclub on 53D Street, Edna's nerves suddenly collapsed, and she cried to go home. Sloane had been drinking heavily all evening, and he was faintly maudlin, leaning on the table and weeping a little with his face in his hands. Quickly Anson gave them his terms. Sloane was to leave town for 6 months, and he must be gone within 48 hours. When he returned, there was to be no resumption of the affair, but at the end of a year Edna might, if she wished, tell Robert Hunter that she wanted a divorce and go about it in the usual way. He paused, gaining confidence from their faces for his final word. "Or there's another thing you can do," he said slowly. "If Edna wants to leave her children, there's nothing I can do to prevent your running off together." "I want to go home," cried Edna again. "Oh, haven't you done enough to us for one day?" Outside it was dark, save for a blurred glow from 6th Avenue down the street. In that light, those two who had been lovers looked for the last time into each other's tragic faces, realizing that between them there was not enough youth and strength to avert their eternal parting. Sloane walked suddenly off down the street, and Anson tapped a dozing taxi driver on the arm. It was almost 4. There was a patient flow of cleaning water along the ghostly pavement of 5th Avenue, and the shadows of 2 night women flitted over the dark facade of St. Thomas's Church. Then the desolate shrubbery of Central Park, where Anson had often played as a child, and the mounting numbers, significant as names, of the marching streets. This was his city, he thought, where his name had flourished through 5 generations. No change could alter the permanence of its place here, for change itself was the essential substratum by which he and those of his name identified themselves with the spirit of New York. resourcefulness, and a powerful will, for his threats in weaker hands would have been less than nothing, had beaten the gathering dust from his uncle's name, from the name of his family, from even this shivering figure that sat beside him in the car. Carrie Sloane's body was found next morning on the lower shelf of a pillar of Queensboro Bridge. In the darkness and in his excitement, he had thought that it was the water flowing black beneath him, but in less than a second it made no possible difference, unless he had planned to think one last thought of Edna and call out her name as he struggled feebly in the water. Chapter 7. Anson never blamed himself for his part in this affair. The situation which brought it about had not been of his making, but the just suffer with the unjust, and he found that his oldest and somehow his most precious friendship was over. He never knew what distorted story Edna told, but he was welcome in his uncle's house no longer. Just before Christmas, Mrs. Hunter retired to a select Episcopal heaven, and Anson became the responsible head of his family. An unmarried aunt who had lived with them for years ran the house, and attempted with helpless inefficiency to chaperone the younger girls. All the children were less self-reliant than Anson, more conventional both in their virtues and in their shortcomings. Mrs. Hunter's death had postponed the debut of one daughter and the wedding of another. Also, it had taken something deeply material from all of them, for with her passing the quiet, expensive superiority of the Hunters came to an end. For one thing, the estate, considerably diminished by 2 inheritance taxes and soon to be divided among 6 children, was not a notable fortune anymore. Anson saw a tendency in his youngest sisters to speak rather respectfully of families that hadn't existed 20 years ago. His own feeling of precedence was not echoed in them. Sometimes they were conventionally snobbish, that was all. For another thing, this was the last summer they would spend on the Connecticut estate. The clamor against it was too loud. Who wants to waste the best months of the year shut up in that dead old town? Reluctantly he yielded. The house would go into the market in the fall, and next summer they would rent a smaller place in Westchester County. It was a step down from the expensive simplicity of his father's idea, and, while he sympathized with the revolt, it also annoyed him. During his mother's lifetime he had gone up there at least every other weekend, even in the gayest summers. Yet he himself was part of this change, and his strong instinct for life had turned him in his 20s from the hollow obsequies of that abortive leisure class. He did not see this clearly. He still felt that there was a norm, a standard of society. But there was no norm. It was doubtful if there had ever been a true norm in New York. The few who still paid and fought to enter a particular set succeeded only to find that as a society it scarcely functioned. Or, what was more alarming, that the bohemia from which they fled sat above them at table. At 29, Anson's chief concern was his own growing loneliness. He was sure now that he would never marry. The number of weddings at which he had officiated as best man or usher was past all counting. There was a drawer at home that bulged with the official neckties of this or that wedding party, neckties standing for romances that had not endured a year, for couples who had passed completely from his life. Scarf pins, gold pencils, cuff buttons, presents from a generation of grooms had passed through his jewel box and been lost. And with every ceremony he was less and less able to imagine himself in the groom's place. Under his hearty goodwill toward all those marriages there was despair about his own. And as he neared 30, he became not a little depressed at the inroads that marriage, especially lately, had made upon his friendships. Groups of people had a disconcerting tendency to dissolve and disappear. The men from his own college, and it was upon them he had expended the most time and affection, were the most elusive of all. Most of them were drawn deep into domesticity. 2 were dead. 1 lived abroad. 1 was in Hollywood writing continuities for pictures that Anson went faithfully to see. Most of them, however, were permanent commuters with an intricate family life centering around some suburban country club, and it was from these that he felt his estrangement most keenly. In the early days of their married life they had all needed him. He gave them advice about their slim finances. He exorcised their doubts about the advisability of bringing a baby into 2 rooms and a bath. Especially he stood for the great world outside. But now their financial troubles were in the past, and the fearfully expected child had evolved into an absorbing family. They were always glad to see old Anson, but they dressed up for him and tried to impress him with their present importance and kept their troubles to themselves. They needed him no longer. A few weeks before his 30th birthday, the last of his early and intimate friends was married. Anson acted in his usual role of best man, gave his usual silver tea service, and went down to the usual Homeric to say goodbye. It was a hot Friday afternoon in May, and as he walked from the pier he realized that Saturday closing had begun, and he was free until Monday morning. Go where? He asked himself. The Yale Club, of course. Bridge until dinner, then 4 or 5 raw cocktails in somebody's room, and a pleasant confused evening. He regretted that this afternoon's groom wouldn't be along. They had always been able to cram so much into such nights. They knew how to attach women and how to get rid of them, how much consideration any girl deserved from their intelligent hedonism. A party was an adjusted thing. You took certain girls to certain places and spent just so much on their amusement. You drank a little, not much, more than you ought to drink, and at a certain time in the morning you stood up and said you were going home. You avoided college boys, sponges, future engagements, fights, sentiment, and indiscretions. That was the way it was done. All the rest was dissipation. In the morning you were never violently sorry. You made no resolutions, but if you had overdone it and your heart was slightly out of order, you went on the wagon for a few days without saying anything about it and waited until an accumulation of nervous boredom projected you into another party. The lobby of the Yale Club was unpopulated. In the bar 3 very young alumni looked up at him, momentarily and without curiosity. "Hello there, Oscar," he said to the bartender. "Mr. Cahill been around this afternoon?" "Mr. Cahill's gone to New Haven." "Oh, that's so?" "Gone to the ball game. Lot of men gone up." Anson looked once again into the lobby, considered for a moment, and then walked out and over to Fifth Avenue. From the broad window of one of his clubs, one that he had scarcely visited in 5 years, a gray man with watery eyes stared down at him. Anson looked quickly away. That figure sitting in vacant resignation, in supercilious solitude, depressed him. He stopped and, retracing his steps, started over 47th Street toward Teak Warden's apartment. Teak and his wife had once been his most familiar friends. It was a household where he and Dolly Carger had been used to go in the days of their affair. But Teak had taken to drink, and his wife had remarked publicly that Anson was a bad influence on him. The remark reached Anson in an exaggerated form. When it was finally cleared up, the delicate spell of intimacy was broken, never to be renewed. "Is Mr. Warden at home?" he inquired. "They've gone to the country." The fact unexpectedly cut at him. They were gone to the country and he hadn't known. 2 years before he would have known the date, the hour, come up at the last moment for a final drink, and planned his first visit to them. Now they had gone without a word. Anson looked at his watch and considered a weekend with his family, but the only train was a local that would jolt through the aggressive heat for 3 hours. And tomorrow in the country and Sunday, he was in no mood for Porchbridge with polite undergraduates, and dancing after dinner at a rural roadhouse, a diminutive of gaiety which his father had estimated too well. "Oh, no," he said to himself. No. He was a dignified, impressive young man, rather stout now, but otherwise unmarked by dissipation. He could have been cast for a pillar of something. At times you were sure it was not society, at others nothing else, for the law, for the church. He stood for a few minutes motionless on the sidewalk in front of a 47th Street apartment house. For almost the first time in his life, he had nothing whatever to do. Then he began to walk briskly up Fifth Avenue, as if he had just been reminded of an important engagement there. The necessity of dissimulation is one of the few characteristics that we share with dogs, and I think of Anson on that day as some well-bred specimen who had been disappointed at a familiar back door. He was going to see Nick, once a fashionable bartender in demand at all private dances, and now employed in cooling non-alcoholic champagne among the labyrinthine cellars of the Plaza Hotel. "Nick," he said, "what's happened to everything?" "Dead," Nick said. "Make me a whiskey sour." Anson handed a pint bottle over the counter. Nick, the girls are different. I had a little girl in Brooklyn and she got married last week without letting me know. That a fact? Ha ha ha, responded Nick diplomatically. Slipped it over on you. Absolutely, said Anson. And I was out with her the night before. Ha ha ha, said Nick. Ha ha ha. Do you remember the wedding, Nick, in Hot Springs where I had the waiters and the musicians singing God Save the King? Now where was that, Mr. Hunter? Nick concentrated doubtfully. Seems to me that was. Next time they were back for more, and I began to wonder how much I'd paid them, continued Anson. Seems to me that was at Mr. Trenholm's wedding. Don't know him, said Anson decisively. He was offended that a strange name should intrude upon his reminiscences. Nick perceived this. Nah, he admitted. I ought to know that. It was one of your crowd break-ins? Baker, said Anson responsively. They put me in a hearse after it was over and covered me up with flowers and drove me away. Ha ha, said Nick. Ha ha ha. Nick's simulation of the old family servant paled presently and Anson went upstairs to the lobby. He looked around. His eyes met the glance of an unfamiliar clerk at the desk, then fell upon a flower from the morning's marriage hesitating in the mouth of a brass cuspidor. He went out and walked slowly toward the blood-red sun over Columbus Circle. Suddenly he turned around and, retracing his steps to the plaza, immured himself in a telephone booth. Later he said that he tried to get me 3 times that afternoon, that he tried everyone who might be in New York. Men and girls he had not seen for years, an artist's model of his college days whose faded number was still in his address book. Central told him that even the exchange existed no longer. At length his quest roved into the country, and he held brief, disappointing conversations with emphatic butlers and maids. So-and-so was out, riding, swimming, playing golf, sailed to Europe last week. Who shall I say phoned? It was intolerable that he should pass the evening alone. The private reckonings which one plans for a moment of leisure lose every charm when the solitude is enforced. There were always women of a sort, but the ones he knew had temporarily vanished, and to pass a New York evening in the hired company of a stranger never occurred to him. He would have considered that that was something shameful and secret, the diversion of a traveling salesman in a strange town. Anson paid the telephone bill. The girl tried unsuccessfully to joke with him about its size, and for the second time that afternoon started to leave the plaza and go he knew not where. Near the revolving door the figure of a woman, obviously with child, stood sideways to the light. A sheer beige cape fluttered at her shoulders when the door turned and, each time, she looked impatiently toward it as if she were weary of waiting. At the first sight of her a strong, nervous thrill of familiarity went over him, but not until he was within 5 feet of her did he realize that it was Paula. Why, Anson Hunter? His heart turned over. Why, Paula? Why, this is wonderful. I can't believe it, Anson. She took both his hands, and he saw in the freedom of the gesture that the memory of him had lost poignancy to her, but not to him. He felt that old mood that she evoked in him stealing over his brain, that gentleness with which he had always met her optimism as if afraid to mar its surface. We're at Rye for the summer. Pete had to come east on business. You know, of course, I'm Mrs. Peter Haggerty now, so we brought the children and took a house. You've got to come out and see us. Can I? He asked directly. When? When you like. Here's Pete. The revolving door functioned, giving up a fine tall man of 30 with a tan face and a trim mustache. His immaculate fitness made a sharp contrast with Anson's increasing bulk, which was obvious under the faintly tight cutaway coat. You oughtn't to be standing, said Haggerty to his wife. Let's sit down here. He indicated lobby chairs, but Paula hesitated. I've got to go right home, she said. Anson, why don't you come out and have dinner with us tonight? We're just getting settled, but if you can stand that. Haggerty confirmed the invitation cordially. Come out for the night. Their car waited in front of the hotel, and Paula with a tired gesture sank back against silk cushions in the corner. There's so much I want to talk to you about, she said. It seems hopeless. I want to hear about you. Well, she smiled at Haggerty, that would take a long time too. I have 3 children, by my first marriage. The oldest is 5, then 4, then 3. She smiled again. I didn't waste much time having them, did I? Boys. A boy and 2 girls. Then, oh, a lot of things happened, and I got a divorce in Paris a year ago and married Pete. That's all, except that I'm awfully happy. In Rye they drove up to a large house near the beach club, from which there issued presently 3 dark, slim children who broke from an English governess and approached them with an esoteric cry. Abstractedly and with difficulty Paula took each one into her arms, a caress which they accepted stiffly, as they had evidently been told not to bump into Mummy. Even against their fresh faces Paula's skin showed scarcely any weariness. For all her physical languor she seemed younger than when he had last seen her at Palm Beach 7 years ago. At dinner she was preoccupied, and afterward, during the homage to the radio, she lay with closed eyes on the sofa, until Anson wondered if his presence at this time were not an intrusion. But at 9 o'clock, when Haggerty rose and said pleasantly that he was going to leave them by themselves for a while, she began to talk slowly about herself and the past. My first baby, she said, the one we called Darling, the biggest little girl. I wanted to die when I knew I was going to have her, because Lowell was like a stranger to me. It didn't seem as though she could be my own. I wrote you a letter and tore it up. Oh, you were so bad to me, Anson. It was the dialogue again, rising and falling. Anson felt a sudden quickening of memory. Weren't you engaged once? She asked. A girl named Dolly something? I wasn't ever engaged. I tried to be engaged, but I never loved anybody but you, Paula. Oh, she said. Then after a moment, this baby is the first one I ever really wanted. You see, I'm in love now, at last. He didn't answer, shocked at the treachery of her remembrance. She must have seen that the at last bruised him, for she continued, I was infatuated with you, Anson. You could make me do anything you liked, but we wouldn't have been happy. I'm not smart enough for you. I don't like things to be complicated like you do. She paused. You'll never settle down, she said. The phrase struck at him from behind. It was an accusation that of all accusations he had never merited. I could settle down if women were different, he said. If I didn't understand so much about them, if women didn't spoil you for other women, if they had only a little pride. If I could go to sleep for a while and wake up into a home that was really mine. Why, that's what I'm made for, Paula. That's what women have seen in me and liked in me. It's only that I can't get through the preliminaries anymore. Haggerty came in a little before 11. After a whiskey, Paula stood up and announced that she was going to bed. She went over and stood by her husband. Where did you go, dearest? She demanded. I had a drink with Ed Saunders. I was worried. I thought maybe you'd run away. She rested her head against his coat. He's sweet, isn't he, Anson? She demanded. Absolutely, said Anson, laughing. She raised her face to her husband. Well, I'm ready, she said. She turned to Anson. Do you want to see our family gymnastics stunt? Yes, he said in an interested voice. All right, here we go. Haggerty picked her up easily in his arms. This is called the family acrobatic stunt, said Paula. He carries me upstairs. Isn't it sweet of him? Yes, said Anson. Haggerty bent his head slightly until his face touched Paula's. And I love him, she said. I've just been telling you, haven't I, Anson? Yes, he said. He's the dearest thing that ever lived in this world. Aren't you, darling? Well, good night. Here we go. Isn't he strong? Yes, Anson said. You'll find a pair of Pete's pajamas laid out for you. Sweet dreams. See you at breakfast. Yes, Anson said. Chapter 8. The older members of the firm insisted that Anson should go abroad for the summer. He had scarcely had a vacation in 7 years, they said. He was stale and needed a change. Anson resisted. If I go, he declared, I won't come back anymore. That's absurd, old man. You'll be back in 3 months with all this depression gone. Fit as ever. No. He shook his head stubbornly. If I stop, I won't go back to work. If I stop, that means I've given up. I'm through. We'll take a chance on that. Stay 6 months if you like. We're not afraid you'll leave us. Why? You'd be miserable if you didn't work. They arranged his passage for him. They liked Anson. Everyone liked Anson, and the change that had been coming over him cast a sort of pall over the office. The enthusiasm that had invariably signaled up business, the consideration toward his equals and his inferiors, the lift of his vital presence. Within the past 4 months, his intense nervousness had melted down these qualities into the fussy pessimism of a man of 40. On every transaction in which he was involved, he acted as a drag and a strain. If I go, I'll never come back, he said. 3 days before he sailed, Paula Legendre Haggerty died in childbirth. I was with him a great deal then, for we were crossing together, but for the first time in our friendship he told me not a word of how he felt, nor did I see the slightest sign of emotion. His chief preoccupation was with the fact that he was 30 years old. He would turn the conversation to the point where he could remind you of it and then fall silent, as if he assumed that the statement would start a chain of thought sufficient to itself. Like his partners, I was amazed at the change in him, and I was glad when the Paris moved off into the wet space between the worlds, leaving his principality behind. How about a drink? He suggested. We walked into the bar with that defiant feeling that characterizes the day of departure and ordered 4 martinis. After one cocktail, a change came over him. He suddenly reached across and slapped my knee with the first joviality I had seen him exhibit for months. "Did you see that girl in the red tam?" he demanded. "The one with the high color who had the 2 police dogs down to bid her goodbye." "She's pretty," I agreed. "I looked her up in the purser's office and found out that she's alone. I'm going down to see the steward in a few minutes. We'll have dinner with her tonight." After a while he left me, and within an hour he was walking up and down the deck with her, talking to her in his strong, clear voice. Her red tam was a bright spot of color against the steel-green sea, and from time to time she looked up with a flashing bob of her head and smiled with amusement and interest and anticipation. At dinner we had champagne, and were very joyous. Afterward Anson ran the pool with infectious gusto, and several people who had seen me with him asked me his name. He and the girl were talking and laughing together on a lounge in the bar when I went to bed. I saw less of him on the trip than I had hoped. He wanted to arrange a foursome, but there was no one available, so I saw him only at meals. Sometimes, though, he would have a cocktail in the bar, and he told me about the girl in the red tam, and his adventures with her, making them all bizarre and amusing, as he had a way of doing, and I was glad that he was himself again, or at least the self that I knew, and with which I felt at home. I don't think he was ever happy unless someone was in love with him, responding to him like filings to a magnet, helping him to explain himself, promising him something. What it was I do not know. Perhaps they promised that there would always be women in the world who would spend their brightest, freshest, rarest hours to nurse and protect that superiority he cherished in his heart.